July 26, 1945. Evans Mill Road, Republic Aviation Field, Farmingdale, Long Island. 8 in the morning. The temperature is already climbing past 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and the humidity that rolls in off the sound is thick enough to bead on the leading edge of the wing. On the apron sits an airplane that looks almost like a P-47 Thunderbolt, and yet, to anyone who has ever seen a Thunderbolt up close, looks deeply, fundamentally wrong. The fuselage is too long, the nose is too narrow, the engine cowling tapers to a sharp point rather than the broad, blunt face of the radial engine that has defined the Jug's silhouette since 1942. There is a scoop under the chin that nobody has seen before, and the entire belly of the aircraft has been deepened to accommodate ductwork that vanishes back toward the tail. The propeller, when it begins to spin, sounds nothing like a Thunderbolt. There is no deep, throaty bellow of an 18-cylinder radial. There is instead a smoother, harder, almost European note, the sound of a liquid-cooled inline engine, 16 cylinders firing in sequence, displacing more than 2,000 cubic inches of aluminum and steel. The aircraft is the XP-47H. The engine is the Chrysler XI-2220. It is producing 2,500 horsepower. It is, on this morning, in July of 1945, one of the most powerful piston engines in the world. It is also, although nobody on the field that morning yet knows it for certain, 11 days late. 11 days from this moment, on August 6th, a B-29 named Enola Gay will drop a uranium bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days after that, another B-29 will drop a plutonium bomb on Nagasaki. 6 days after that, on August 15th, Japan will surrender. The war will end. The reason for the existence of the engine in front of the men on this field, the reason that Chrysler Corporation has spent 5 years and millions of dollars and the labor of dozens of its best engineers building it, will evaporate inside 3 weeks. The XI-2220 will fly. It will perform almost exactly as predicted. It will reach 490 miles per hour at 35,000 feet on one of its later flights. It will demonstrate that the principles its designers had committed to in 1940 were sound, that hemispherical combustion chambers could deliver power densities no one else in American industry had achieved, that an inverted V16 could be made to run smoothly and reliably. And it will be canceled in November when a propeller shaft breaks during a test flight, and the men who built it will pack their drawings into filing cabinets and walk away from a project that, had it been ready a year earlier, might have been the most powerful piston engine ever produced. This is the story of an engine that came too late, and of why it came too late, and of what the men who built it took from the experience and used it to do something else, something that the people who drove their cars in the 1950s would learn to recognize by the sound it made and the badge it wore on the air cleaner. The XI-2220 never went to war, but the people who built it and the lessons they learned building it would go on to define an entire era of American performance engineering. The engine itself sits today in a museum in Connecticut and in another in Chantilly, Virginia, and in a private collection. The descendants of the engine, in spirit if not in literal genealogy, sit under the hoods of muscle cars at car shows from Pomona to Atlantic City every weekend of every summer. To understand the XI-2220, you have to start with 3 men, an event in 1909, and a country that did not yet exist as an automotive power. In 1909, the Alice Chalmers Manufacturing Company of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, ran an apprenticeship program for young mechanical engineers. They selected 25 recent graduates each year from American universities and put them through a 2-year rotation across the company's product lines. 2 of the men selected in 1909 were Frederick Morell Zetter, a recent graduate of the University of Michigan, and Carl Breyer, who had completed his degree at Throop Polytechnic Institute in Pasadena, the school that would later become the California Institute of Technology. Breyer was the son of a German immigrant blacksmith who had built one of the first brick houses in Los Angeles. He had grown up in a thrifty family that made its own tricycles and bicycles and dog-drawn wagons, and as a boy, he had visited the Los Angeles waterworks and become obsessed with engineering. By the time he met Zetter in Milwaukee in 1909, he had already built his own generator to light his family's house and had begun drawing detailed plans for a two-cylinder steam engine of his own design. The two men became friends. They moved to Studebaker in South Bend, Indiana in the early teens, and there they were joined by a third engineer, a man named Owen Ray Skelton, who had previously worked for Pope, Packard, and Benham. The three of them, Zetter, Skelton, and Breyer, formed an engineering team so closely linked that by the early 1920s, the automotive press had taken to calling them the Three Musketeers. When a man named Walter Chrysler took over the failing Maxwell Motor Company in 1925 and refounded it as the Chrysler Corporation, the first thing he did was hire the Three Musketeers. They came as a unit. They reported as a unit. They designed the first Chrysler automobile as a unit. And for the next 2 decades, every major engineering decision at Chrysler Corporation, every engine, every chassis, every body, passed across the desks of those three men. The Three Musketeers were, by the standards of American automotive engineering in the 1920s, intellectually adventurous in a way most of their colleagues were not. Breyer, in particular, had become fascinated by aerodynamics. He had grown up watching the first generation of powered aircraft develop, and in 1927, while vacationing at Gratiot Beach on Lake Huron in Michigan, he had watched a flight of Army Air Corps pursuit planes returning to Selfridge Field and had begun musing on the contrast between what aviation engineers had learned about reducing air resistance and what automotive engineers had stubbornly refused to consider. He went home and consulted Orville Wright, the surviving Wright brother, who advised him to build a wind tunnel. Breyer did. Chrysler Engineering built a wind tunnel in the basement of its research building in 1930, possibly the first one in the American automotive industry, and the data that came out of it convinced Breyer and his colleagues that the entire shape of the conventional 1920s automobile was wrong. In 1934, Chrysler Corporation introduced the Airflow, a car shaped according to the principles Breyer's wind tunnel had revealed. It was a commercial disaster. The buying public, presented with a car designed by engineers, refused to buy it. The Airflow was discontinued by 1937, and the lesson Chrysler's marketing department drew from the experience was that engineering ambition should not be allowed to dictate consumer products. But the engineering staff did not draw that lesson. They simply concluded that they would need to find other outlets for their ambition. That outlet, when it came, was a phone call from the United States Air Corps in the spring of 1940. By the spring of 1940, the war in Europe had been underway for 8 months. The German air offensive against Poland in September 1939 had impressed American observers. The German air assault that would shortly be unleashed against France and the Low Countries beginning May 10th was about to impress them a great deal more. The American Army Air Corps, watching this from across the Atlantic with growing anxiety, understood that its existing fighter aircraft, the Curtiss P-36 and the Bell P-39, and the developing Curtiss P-40 were not in the same performance class as the German Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the British Supermarine Spitfire. American fighter engines were not powerful enough. The Allison V-1710, which was the only domestically designed liquid-cooled fighter engine in production, made 1,200 horsepower in its best contemporary configuration, which was respectable for 1940, but plainly insufficient for the airplanes that would be needed in 1943 or 1944. The Wright 1820 and the Pratt & Whitney R-1830, the principal American radial engines, were excellent but constrained by their displacement and frontal area. The Air Corps wanted, very badly, a new engine. They wanted 2,500 horsepower. They wanted it in a package that would fit inside a pursuit fighter with the smallest possible frontal area, the lowest possible drag penalty, and the smoothest possible running characteristics. And they wanted it from an American company. Chrysler Corporation, in May of 1940, had been carrying out paper studies of a very large aircraft engine for a few weeks. The studies were preliminary and informal, the kind of work an engineering department does between major production programs to keep its design staff exercised. When the Air Corps tender went out on June 22, 1940, Chrysler responded on July 2nd. By the standards of how American defense contracts moved in 1940, this was extraordinarily fast. The proposal that came back was unusual, even radical. Chrysler did not propose the conventional V12 that Allison and Rolls-Royce had standardized on. They did not propose a radial because every other American manufacturer was building radials, and the Air Corps had explicitly asked for a low frontal area inline. They did not propose sleeve valves, which Bristol in England was working on as a way to get higher RPM out of radial cylinders. Chrysler proposed an inverted V16, two banks of 8 cylinders each arranged at a 60-degree included angle, with the cylinder heads pointing downward and the crankshaft above. The propeller drive would not come from one end of the crankshaft as in a conventional engine, but from the middle, between the two V8 sections of the crankshaft, through a reduction gear tower that descended below the engine to the propeller shaft. This configuration would put the propeller shaft well below the cylinder bores, which would allow cannons or machine guns to be mounted between the cylinder banks and fired through the propeller hub. It would also split the torsional loads on the crankshaft, allowing a much shorter and stiffer crankshaft than a conventional 16 would have required. The engine would displace 2,220 cubic inches, more precisely 2,219.35 cubic inches. Each cylinder would have a bore of 5 8/10 inches and a stroke of 5 1/4 inches. It would use hemispherical combustion chambers with a single spark plug centered in the dome of each chamber. This was Chrysler's first experiment with what would later become world-famous as the HEMI design. The advantages were significant. The hemispherical chamber allowed the inlet and exhaust valves to be placed on opposite sides of the dome, which gave more open flow paths than the wedge-shaped chambers used by most contemporary American engines. It also placed the spark plug at the geometric center of the charge, which produced more uniform combustion, faster flame propagation, and resistance to detonation at high compression ratios. These were not new ideas in 1940. Hemispherical combustion chambers had been used in racing engines and in some aviation engines for decades, but Chrysler had never built one. The XI-2220 was the company's first attempt at the design, and the engineering team that built it would carry the hemispherical chamber forward into the post-war era and make it the defining feature of an entire generation of American performance engines. The man in overall charge of the program was Carl Breyer himself, by then the director of research at Chrysler Corporation. Working under him was Mel Carpentier, head of engine design. Under Carpentier was Bill Drinkard, head of the motor room in engine development and testing, and after him, Harold Welch. The day-to-day engineering team included men whose names would be remembered inside Chrysler for the next half-century. Sid Terry, who would become one of the company's leading transmission engineers, Robert S. Rary, who would later design several of Chrysler's most important post-war engines, R. Dean Engel, Ev Moeller, George Hubner, who would eventually rise to become Carl Breyer's successor at head of research and would lead Chrysler's turbine engine program in the 1950s and 1960s, Herb Bevins, Willem Weertman, who would later credit these men as the foundation of post-war Chrysler engineering, Pete Hagenbuch, who would retire decades later as head of engine tuning, remembered the V16 as essentially looking like an upside-down version of the 1951 Chrysler HEMI V8. He noted that this was not a coincidence. The same men had designed both. The work began in earnest in late 1940 and through 1941. Single-cylinder test engines were built first to develop and refine the hemispherical combustion chamber. These ran on the test stands at Chrysler's engineering facility in Highland Park, Michigan, in May of 1941. The results were promising. Cylinder pressures were within target, specific fuel consumption was favorable, heat transfer to the cooling jackets was manageable. The team scaled the design up through 2-cylinder and then 4-cylinder test units, working through valve timing, intake manifold geometry, and exhaust system architecture. By the middle of 1942, they were ready to assemble the first complete 16-cylinder engine. It ran for the first time on the test stand at the end of 1942. This is where the trouble began to set in. A complete XI-2220 engine in its original configuration weighed approximately 2,384 pounds. It was a little over 10 feet long, including the accessories case bolted onto the rear of the block. The cylinder block was a single piece of cast aluminum, which was a remarkable piece of foundry work in 1942, given that nobody in America had previously cast an aluminum block of that size for a high-performance engine. The crankshaft, which had to be machined from a single steel forging, was one of the most demanding crankshaft fabrications anyone in American industry had ever attempted. The propeller reduction gearbox in the center of the engine, with its complex layout of bevel gears and idlers driving a propeller shaft that exited beneath the crankshaft and ran the full length of the engine forward to the propeller hub, was a design that had no precedent in American aviation. The turbo supercharger, supplied by General Electric, was a CH-5 unit, the same type used on the standard P-47, but adapted to the very different exhaust gas flow of a 16-cylinder liquid-cooled engine. Between the turbocharger and the engine's mechanical supercharger, Chrysler had installed an intercooler, and behind the supercharger, an aftercooler, both liquid-cooled. The result, when it all worked together, was that the XI-2220 could maintain its maximum rated power all the way up to 25,000 feet, which was an altitude performance superior to any production American piston engine of the era. But getting it all to work together was not a simple matter of assembling parts. Every interface between systems had to be developed essentially from scratch, because no one had built an engine of this configuration before. Throughout 1943, the engine ran on the test stands at Highland Park and accumulated hours. The team chased problems: cooling jacket distortion, cracked exhaust manifolds, bearing surface wear at the central propeller drive, vibration modes in the long propeller shaft. The hemispherical heads, beautifully efficient in combustion, were difficult to manufacture in production-grade quantities because the valve seat geometry had to be cut at angles that required custom tooling. The intake manifold, which had to deliver supercharged air evenly to 16 cylinders arranged in 2 banks, went through a dozen revisions before the team was satisfied with the cylinder-to-cylinder mixture distribution. The ignition system was a special engineering challenge because the firing order of a 16-cylinder V engine at a 60-degree included angle does not produce evenly spaced firing pulses. The magnetos had to be custom designed to fire at the specific intervals the engine required, and getting that timing right consumed months of bench work. Meanwhile, in early 1942, the Curtiss-Wright Corporation had selected the XI-2220 to power a high-altitude interceptor called the XP-60C. Curtiss was struggling to find a powerful enough engine to make the P-60 airframe competitive with the new generation of American fighters that was emerging. The XI-2220 promised the power they needed. But by 1943, with the XI-2220 still bogged down in development, Curtiss had given up on Chrysler's engine and switched to a Pratt & Whitney radial. The XP-60C never went into production. The Republic Aviation Corporation, however, was more patient. Republic was already building the P-47 Thunderbolt in large numbers, powered by the Pratt & Whitney R-2800. They had room in their plant, room in their engineering schedule, and the willingness to set aside 2 airframes for an experimental conversion. The Army Air Forces authorized the conversion of 2 P-47D-15RA Razorback airframes into XP-47H test aircraft. The work began in 1944.
The conversion was substantial. The original Pratt & Whitney radial, 60 inches in diameter, was replaced with the long, narrow XI-2220. Less than 34 inches in diameter, but more than 10 feet from the propeller hub to the rear accessories. To make the engine fit, Republic's engineers had to extend the forward fuselage and deepen the belly to accept the cooling radiator and the ductwork for the turbocharger. The aircraft's cross-section, which had been dominated by the bulk of the radial cowling, was now dominated by the depth of the fuselage required to house the cooling system. The original P-47's ammunition bays were removed entirely. The XP-47H carried no guns. It was a flying testbed for the engine, nothing more. Two airframes, serial numbers 42-23297 and 42-23298, were built in 1944. The first engine, an XI-2220-11 with serial number D000001, was delivered for installation in late 1944. Throughout the early months of 1945, Republic and Chrysler engineers worked side by side at Farmingdale to make the engine, the airframe, and the cooling system function as an integrated unit. The complications were considerable. The XI-2220's cooling requirements were greater than any liquid-cooled fighter engine Republic had previously installed. The turbocharger ducting had to be reworked multiple times. Vibration testing on the engine mounts revealed harmonics that had not appeared during bench testing, requiring redesign of the mount structure. By the spring of 1945, with Germany on the verge of collapse and the Pacific War moving toward its final phase, the team was still working through the last problems. The first flight, when it finally came on July 26, 1945, was undramatic by the standards of aviation testing. The aircraft taxied. It accelerated, it lifted off, it climbed, it performed an initial functional check, it returned to the field. The engine had run cleanly, the cooling system had held, the controls had responded as predicted. Carl Breyer was on the field that day with a movie camera. The film he shot, in color, is one of the few surviving visual records of the XP-47H in flight. It shows the aircraft taxiing and taking off, the propeller blurring, the slender nose pointed at the summer sky over Long Island. Breyer was 61 years old. He had been working on aircraft engines on and off for 35 years. He must have known, watching the airplane he had spent 5 years bringing into being lift off the runway, that he was watching it 11 days before the world that had asked for it was about to disappear. The Hiroshima bomb fell on August 6th. The Nagasaki bomb fell on August 9th. Japan announced its surrender on August 15th. The instrument of surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri on September 2nd. By the end of September, the Army Air Forces, which now had no enemy to fight, were scaling back every experimental program in the inventory. The strategic situation that had justified the XI-2220 program in 1940 had been the urgent need for a high-altitude fighter engine to confront a German Air Force that by August of 1945 had not flown a meaningful combat mission in months. The new threat, to the extent there was a new threat, was Soviet, and the Air Forces understood that the future of high-performance combat aircraft was not in piston engines at all, it was in jet engines. The P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, was already entering service. The British de Havilland Vampire and the Gloucester Meteor were operational. The Germans had flown the Me-262 in combat. The jet age had arrived, and it had arrived during the same months that the XP-47H had been making its first test flights. The XP-47H flew through August and September of 1945. On one of the later flights in September, it recorded a maximum true airspeed of 490 miles per hour at 35,000 feet. For a piston-engined fighter, this was an exceptional figure. Few production aircraft of the era could match it. The standard P-51D Mustang, the fastest American piston fighter in widespread service, topped out at around 437 miles per hour. The XP-47H, even with the complications of its experimental engine installation, was capable of speeds that put it within reach of the early American jets. But the early American jets were getting faster every month, and they did not need the 4,000 pounds of cooling system, exhaust ducting, and rotating machinery that the XI-2220 required. In November of 1945, during a routine test flight, the propeller shaft of the XP-47H broke. The aircraft was recovered safely, but the program was effectively over. The second XP-47H, with the second engine, never flew. The Army Air Forces formally terminated the contract. Chrysler's engineering team, which had been working full-time on the XI-2220 for almost 5 years, was reassigned to other projects. The drawings were packed into filing cabinets. The remaining engines, 6 of which had been built, were dispersed. 1 went into long-term storage. 3 eventually ended up in museums. The 2 XP-47H airframes were scrapped. The story would end there, except for what happened next, which is that the men who had spent 5 years learning how to build hemispherical combustion chambers and aluminum cylinder blocks and high-output engines for aviation now had nowhere obvious to apply those skills. The aviation engine market, which had seemed so promising in 1940, was collapsing. The piston engine industry that had fed the war effort was contracting. Pratt & Whitney and Wright Aeronautical were laying off engineers by the thousands. Chrysler Corporation, which had built tanks and engines and airframe components and trucks throughout the war, was returning to its core business of making automobiles. And the engineering team that had built the XI-2220, the team headed by Carl Breer and Mel Carpentier, and including Robert Rary and George Hubner and the rest, was given a new assignment: build us a post-war passenger car engine. The team that had spent 5 years building a 16-cylinder aviation engine with hemispherical combustion chambers, single overhead camshafts, and an aluminum block now applied themselves to the design of a V8 automobile engine. They knew from their wartime work what hemispherical combustion chambers could do. They had built, debugged, and run engines that demonstrated the power, the efficiency, and the detonation resistance of the design. They had developed the manufacturing techniques required to produce hemispherical heads in quantity. They had learned, the hard way, how to manage the valve train geometry, the spark plug placement, the cooling jacket design.
The engine they produced was introduced in 1951. It was called the Firepower. It displaced 331 cubic inches. It produced 180 horsepower in its initial configuration, which was a power output substantially higher than any other American passenger car engine of the same displacement. It had hemispherical combustion chambers with the spark plug centered in the dome of each chamber. It had inlet and exhaust valves placed on opposite sides of the chamber, driven by push rods from a central camshaft. It had a deep skirt cast iron block intended for durability under the loads that hemispherical combustion would generate. Pete Hagenbuch, looking at a cutaway diagram of the Firepower, would later note that it was essentially an inverted, scaled-down, simplified version of one of the cylinder banks of the XI-2220. The genealogy was visible to anyone who knew where to look. The Firepower HEMI entered Chrysler production cars in 1951 and remained in production through 1958. It established Chrysler Corporation as the high-performance engine manufacturer in American automotive industry. Through the 1950s, Chrysler V8 engines based on the HEMI design powered the company's full-sized sedans and its experimental show cars. In the late 1950s, the engine evolved into the 392 cubic inch version that powered the Chrysler 300 series of personal luxury cars and made the brand synonymous with high speed and high horsepower. When production of the original HEMI line ended in 1958, the design did not die. It was reawakened in 1964 when Chrysler engineers, including some of the same men who had worked on the XI-2220 24 years earlier, developed the 426 HEMI for stock car and drag racing. The 426 HEMI went into production in 1966 and became one of the most famous racing and street engines in American history. It dominated NASCAR superspeedways. It dominated NHRA Top Fuel and funny car drag racing. It powered street machines that became legends among American teenagers: the Dodge Charger Daytona, the Plymouth Superbird, the HEMI Cuda. The badge on the air cleaner said HEMI, and every car enthusiast in America in 1970 knew what that meant. Almost nobody knew where it had come from. The connection back through the Firepower to the XI-2220, the connection to Carl Breer and his engineering team standing on the apron at Farmingdale in July of 1945, watching their war engine lift off 11 days too late, was lost to the public memory almost immediately. The men who had worked on it knew. Pete Hagenbuch knew.
Willem Weertman, who had joined Chrysler Engineering after the war and worked alongside the V16 veterans, knew. Inside the company, the lineage was understood and preserved. Outside, it was simply the HEMI, the engine that had appeared in 1951 as if from nowhere and that had then conquered American performance racing for 2 decades. Carl Breer retired from Chrysler in the early 1950s. He was succeeded as head of research by George Hubner, the young engineer who had worked on the XI-2220 in 1942 and who would lead Chrysler's post-war turbine engine program. Breer was inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame in 1976. He died in Detroit in 1970, having seen the HEMI engine he had helped birth become a defining symbol of American performance culture. Fred Zeter had died in 1951, before the Firepower entered production. Owen Skelton retired from active engineering work in 1946. The three musketeers who had built Chrysler Corporation in the 1920s and had carried it through the war did not live to see the full flowering of the technology their wartime program had developed, but the technology lived.
The XI-2220 itself survives in 3 engines, each of which has its own story. Engine D00001, the first complete production configuration unit, sits today in the New England Air Museum in Windsor Locks, Connecticut, on long-term loan or transfer from the Smithsonian. Engine D00006, the unit that flew in the XP-47H, sits at the Smithsonian's Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center in Chantilly, Virginia, displayed with the firewall forward section of one of the XP-47H airframes. Engine D00005 is held by the Chrysler Foundation, the historical archive of what was once Chrysler Corporation, now part of Stellantis. Visitors to the New England Air Museum can stand in front of the XI-2220 and look at the cluster of intake manifolds and exhaust collectors and the long, sloping cylinder banks and the central propeller reduction gearbox. And it is possible, if you look carefully, to see the lineage that runs from this engine to the Firepower of 1951, to the 426 HEMI of 1966, to the engines that still power Dodge muscle cars in the 2020s under names like 6.4-liter and 6.2-liter Hellcat. The architecture is different. The hemispherical chambers, the centralized spark plugs, the opposed valves, the philosophy of the design, these are continuous from the 1940s to the present. The XP-47H is a different story. Both airframes were scrapped at Republic Aviation in the autumn of 1945, victims of the post-war disposal of every experimental aircraft for which no further use could be found. There are perhaps 3 dozen photographs of the airplane in flight and a few minutes of color film shot by Carl Breer that summer. The serial numbers 42-23297 and 42-23298 exist now only in records. The aircraft itself does not. If the XI-2220 had been ready a year earlier in the summer of 1944, what would have happened? Republic Aviation had production capacity to build XP-47H derivatives in significant numbers if the engine had been available. The Army Air Forces had committed in 1942 to the proposition that they needed a high-altitude fighter capable of escorting B-29 raids over Japan from bases in the Marianas. The P-47N, which actually performed this mission in 1945, was a long-range development of the standard P-47 with the Pratt & Whitney R-2800. An XP-47H-derived fighter with the Chrysler engine would have been faster at altitude, with a smaller frontal area and, on paper, better high-altitude performance. Whether this would have meaningfully changed the air war over Japan is a question that has no answer, because the engine was not ready. Even with the engine, the production tooling, the maintenance manuals, the parts supply chain, all the infrastructure that would have been required to put XI-2220-powered Thunderbolts into operational service did not exist in 1944. It had been developed during the war, for the radial engine, not for an entirely new liquid-cooled inline.
The lead time for converting a working prototype into an operational combat aircraft, even under wartime urgency, was typically 2 years. By the time the engine flew in July 1945, 2 years from operational deployment would have been July 1947. By July 1947, the F-86 Sabre was flying, and the world had moved on.
There is a particular sadness in studying programs like the XI-2220. The men who worked on it were among the most talented engineers of their generation. They built something that, on its own technical merits, was an achievement of the first order. They proved out a combustion chamber geometry, a manufacturing approach, a power density philosophy that would dominate American performance engineering for the next 30 years. And they did all of this for a purpose that had evaporated before their work was complete. The 5 years they spent on the XI-2220 produced no operational combat aircraft. No enemy was defeated by their engine. No bomber formation was escorted by it. No pilot's life was saved by its performance. In the bookkeeping of the war effort, the XI-2220 was a complete failure, a multi-million-dollar investment in an engine that fired its first shot in anger, never. But the engineers themselves did not, by all accounts, see it that way. They had built something. They had pushed the state-of-the-art forward. They had learned how to do things they had not known how to do before. And when the war ended and the contract was canceled and the drawings went into the filing cabinets, they walked over to the next building at Highland Park and started designing the V8 engines that would put a HEMI badge on every Chrysler 300 from 1955 to 1965, and that would put one on every HEMI CUDA from 1970 to 1971, and that would make the word HEMI a permanent piece of the American automotive vocabulary. In 2003, 58 years after the XP-47H first flew, Chrysler reintroduced the HEMI V8 engine in its passenger cars. The new engine, displacing 5.7 liters, used hemispherical combustion chambers descended from the same basic concept that Carl Breer's team had developed for the XI-2220 in 1941. The engineers who designed the new HEMI did not know all of the men who had built the wartime engine. They had been born long after the XP-47H had been scrapped. But they knew the history. The lineage was preserved in Chrysler engineering documents, in the oral traditions of the powertrain department, in the technical training materials new engineers received when they joined the company. The HEMI was not a marketing name pulled from a hat. It was a continuous engineering tradition that ran back to the airplane that took off from Farmingdale 11 days too late to fight the war it had been built for. In the National Air and Space Museum's Udvar Hazy facility, the firewall forward section of one of the XP-47H airframes sits behind glass, with the XI-2220 engine still mounted in it. The engine is dark, oily, machined steel and aluminum, all of it complicated, all of it precise. The exhaust manifolds are the long, sweeping curves of a serious turbocharged engine. The valve covers carry the discrete script of a piece of pre-war American engineering, a product of an industrial culture that was confident enough in its own competence to attempt things no one else had ever tried. Visitors walk past it. Most do not stop. The placard on the wall explains briefly that this was an experimental fighter engine that did not enter service. It does not explain that the engineers who built it went on to define the entire vocabulary of American performance engines. It does not explain that the XI-2220 is, in some real sense, one of the most influential engines in American automotive history, despite never having achieved its original purpose. But that is the way of things with engineering. The work outlasts the war. The lessons outlast the program. The men who built the XI-2220 spent 5 years trying to win a fight that ended without them, and then they spent the next 30 years winning, instead, the fight that nobody had even asked them to enter. The HEMI engine is their monument. The piston aviation engine that they had set out to build was finished and flew and was forgotten. The automobile engine that emerged from its ashes is still in production 80 years later in a country that no longer remembers where it came from. In a war decided by what arrived in time, the XI-2220 did not arrive in time. It is a footnote in the history of the air war. But in the longer history of American engineering, of how technical knowledge moves from one program to another, of how a wartime emergency can quietly seed an entire post-war industrial culture, the XI-2220 is something else. It is the engine that lost its war and won the peace. The men who built it, standing on the apron at Farmingdale in July of 1945 with cameras and clipboards and the smell of high-octane aviation gasoline in the air, did not know yet what they had really built. They thought they had built a fighter engine. They had, in fact, built a foundation. And the foundation is still there.